Okay, so good afternoon from the UK. Obviously, in like places like Australia and New Zealand, it's now middle of the night. Several major sports stories have occurred. Obviously, England lost 1-0 to Italy last night in the Nations League. That's another poor performance, and more pressure is now mounting on Gareth Southgate and his position as England head coach going into the World Cup. The AFL was in the news. Now, obviously, the Geelong Cats beat the Sydney Swans today in the grand final. That's fantastic. However, that's been overshadowed this week with what's happening at the Hawthorn Hawks and the racism scandal that's come out of the review they conducted into basically how they look after current and ex players, predominantly from the Indigenous community. That's Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders to people from outside of Australia. And news broke on Wednesday of the report, and the AFL and the club themselves. I think Hawthorn did the right thing by commissioning the report into how they look after ex-players and how they also look after their current playing group. That's fine. This particular report was designed to look after the needs of current and ex-employees and players who are of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities. What we don't know is what actually is in the report. However, what has come out, we know that at least 3 ex-players or their families have contacted ABC News in Australia. Some of the allegations that have made it into the public domain, even though the players have remained anonymous, are pretty damning. I fear that they're most likely going to be true. I also fear that there's worse yet to come. Gil McLaughlin, the outgoing AFL CEO, I don't think this is how he wants his tenure to end. The AFL is under a lot of pressure to get their investigation right and to do the right thing. Now they've brought in outside investigators into this. The issue I find with this whole situation is they sat on that report for a week. They could have released a press statement saying that there is an ongoing investigation that is external involving an unnamed club and unnamed individuals at that time. I think that lack of action with the report being on the AFL's head office desk for that long, I think, has prompted these unnamed players' families to put pressure via the media into getting the ball rolling. I I fear there's worse to come out. I will be doing a video on the Hawthorn Hawk situation. It'll be a lengthy video because, to be brutally honest, this is not the first racism scandal involving the AFL in the last couple of decades. And that's why I fear that what is in this report and what's going to come out is going to be devastating. What we do know is that the Aboriginal welfare officer was only in 1 day a week. What we know is that young players were pressured into decisions they didn't want to do. And that's where I fear that also if they were to do a much wider review into how players felt their time in the AFL was conducted, a lot of ex-players of all backgrounds would say something similar as well. So the culture within the league and the sport is raised into question. That win at all costs mentality, because in this period of this review, the Hawthorn Hawks won 4 premierships, including 3 in a row. This is at a time when I was actually really getting into AFL about 5, 6, 7 years ago. So the Hawthorn Hawks were a very successful team at the time. In the AFL, they won 4 premierships between 2008 and 2015, including 3 in a row. And this is where this investigation and this report is looking into that period. So the allegations that are coming out are quite serious. I fear there's more than just a grain of truth. I fear that there is worse to come, and I think the AFL, with the report that they have and what they commissioned with independent investigators, people from outside the AFL to look at the report and make recommendations. I fear there's worse in that report that hasn't been leaked to the media, which then raises the question not only about racism and how the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander players and staff have been treated, but also just general young players in general, the player welfare argument. And this is where I hark back to what happened at Essendon with the peptide scandal, that win at all cost mentality, and how player welfare was a secondary concern. I will be doing a video on what's happening at Hawthorn, but I thought I'd mention it because it is in the news, and I think it has overshadowed the AFL Grand Final, which Geelong have won. But what I noticed was the day after this news breaks, Gil McLaughlin, the AFL CEO, is obviously doing the grand final pre-match stuff, media stuff. And of course, Robbie Williams was the pre-match entertainment for the grand final, and there was a big press day, and it was all laughs and giggles. And I think the AFL has been blindsided by what's come out in the media, and I wouldn't be surprised if more stuff comes out, not just from Aboriginal players and ex players, but also from maybe Irish players, because there's a lot of Irish players who've gone over from the Gaelic Amateur Association over to the AFL. I wouldn't be surprised if there's more to come out about player welfare, bullying, racism, pressurising young players to make decisions they don't want to make. And this is bigger than just a racism scandal. This is a culture scandal within how the AFL operates and how clubs operate. Afternoon, Jamie. Now, obviously, I made reference to the 1-0 defeat that England suffered against Italy in the Nations League. Now, we can debate whether the Nations League is the right way to figure out, the international calendar, whether it's a good tournament format. I've never been sold on the Nations League. Thank God I don't have a TV, and I just, watch sport online these days. But what I've seen online on social media, on the mainstream media, when fans are allowed to have their say in a comment section, is a lot of people want Southgate gone. Now, I've never been sold on Southgate's style of play and tactics. We know what our strengths are. He doesn't play to them. I think time is up for Southgate. I think this World Cup's going to be a disaster. The form has dropped off a cliff. Once we were assured of World Cup qualification for the next, for this coming World Cup, once we were assured of that, World Cup qualification, the form's dropped off a cliff in the last 12 months. And some of the team selections now are getting bizarre. Like, how can Pickford and Maguire still be in that England team is beyond me. Not picking form players, picking players on the club they play for and past deeds. Maguire should be nowhere near that England squad. He doesn't even get in the Man United squad anymore. And I feel sorry for Harry Maguire. I really do. I think at Hull and at Leicester he was decent, but he should not be put in that leadership capacity at Man United. And that's a disaster. Yes, so the FA. That's good to hear that Southend and Hertford will be replaying their match in full. We do know from previous incidents in other sports, and there is precedent that they resume play from the time play was ceased. Because it's a cup game and it's a straight knockout, therefore it has to be rearranged. But at least they're using common sense. Either you can't just fully abandon the match and because it's not a league game and therefore call it a draw. It has to be played or finished. But hopefully the player who was injured is going to make a recovery. That is the important thing, and a full recovery at that. We've seen some career-ending injuries, even in the full professional game, that just make you feel physically unwell. So that's hopefully a very positive to come out of it. Is the player who is injured ends up making a recovery, and the match gets played, and both sides can get on with their seasons. That's obviously what you want to see. In regards to the Nations League in general, from what we've seen so far with player comments, performances of teams, I don't honestly think really the players want to really play it. And Southgate's press conference last night was painful. I have seen that press conference in full, and quite honestly, I don't know what positives we can take out of that. If you are a follower of the international side, or you want to see England do well, if you have had such a poor run of form over the last 12 months and you're struggling to win games, and you're saying you can take, this is where Southgate, when he was appointed, the FA was put into a corner with the Sam Allardyce situation. They needed to get someone in there, and Southgate was available at the time and was had been working with the FA with the youth systems and coaching badges, and therefore was available and was already employed by the FA as an interim. Okay, fine. However, I think it's run its course. I think, yes, we've got to a World Cup semi-final and a Euros final. However, the knockout stages, I don't think England have been fluid, and I think they have had some easy draws to make it to the latter stages of this tournament. What we've also seen is poor tactical decisions made, even when games are being won, poor game management, and not being able to put a 90-minute performance in. As I say, that 45 minutes against Albania, for example, in the World Cup qualifier, was the best I've seen England play at any point in my lifetime. However, the second half was one of the most diabolical second halves I've ever seen, and he was making substitutions for substitution's sake. I've never been a fan of the style that Southgate plays, and I've never been a fan of some of his squad selections. Some of his squad selections, for me, for what purpose, I don't know. And don't play to the player's strengths. Uh, yeah, I am really scratching my head at some of the decisions that have been taken within the England system. And yes, that is Southgate. The FA awarding him a contract extension, I think, is not looking good now. And I'm not sold on England getting out of that group. They needed to put a performance in last night against a side that didn't qualify for the World Cup, which would have been vengeance for what happened at the Euros final. Didn't happen. Italy themselves aren't going through a great run of form. And I'm so glad I didn't watch the game. I'm so glad I've never watched a Nations League game, because I don't think the format in reality is the solution to the problems that international football has. I think the Nations League slots should be when you have your qualifying tournaments. That's my opinion. Now, another scary thing is Iran won their last game against Uruguay, so there's a concern. And while the USA aren't playing their best, they qualified with ease to the World Cup. We didn't. And yeah, we can argue about how well the team played, team selections. The squad balance has never been right. There are players who are in form who didn't get a look in, and Southgate has also, whether rightly or wrongly, the team, in my opinion, is very, very young. The average age of this England squad, consistently with Southgate, is getting younger, and several veteran players are needed to give a bit of backbone to the team. A bit of veteran presence is never a bad thing with an international team. So when people are like, when Gary Cahill and Jamie Vardy and Ben Foster basically said we're done with international football, it's not because they weren't capable of playing at that level. It's because of the coach. And of course, Ben Foster's now retired. Jamie Vardy's on his last legs. Gary Cahill, yeah, okay. We can all agree that maybe had they had stayed involved with the England setup or kept themselves available with the England setup, they might have, still played at a high level. May have prolonged their careers. But at the time, they decided to call it a day on their England careers. That was over 4 years ago. Jamie Vardy still had some good seasons in the Premier League. Ben Foster is still, even till the end of his career, was a decent goalkeeper and a decent choice to have if you have, let's say, injuries in net or you need some experience around a squad. When they all came out and said, no, we're done with international football, it wasn't because they weren't capable of playing. It was because of the coach. That, to me, is a worrying sign. Not taking Jamie Vardy to the Euros. Admittedly, it was delayed by a year. But had the Euros taken place in 2020 and COVID not being a thing, I think Jamie Vardy should have still been around that squad. For the experience that he has, he's won silverware. And Jamie Vardy, ironically, his style of play suits the style of play England should be playing. That quick-paced, fast counter-attack play where you're on the edge of that last defender and you're passing with pace and you create attacks at pace and it's all off the cuff. That's how England's, pace and counter-attack is what the England squad, the young players, are actually suited to do. Defensively, too many defenders are in the squad. Midfield, too light, and the wrong players are being selected. He's not. He always. Well, this is one thing that's going to bite Gareth Southgate badly. Is I pick players on form, not on reputation. What's he doing? He's picking players based on the clubs they play for and what they've done in the past, not on current form. And yeah, he's. I think a lot of players. I think he's losing the dressing room. I think players are frustrated. And there are players who aren't producing the goods at club level right now. I mean, Maguire can't even get in the United team, and every game he's started this season, the team he's played in has lost. So I think Southgate. I think Southgate is very, very quickly. He's lost. I think he's going to quickly lose the fans, and then the whole political taking the knee crap, which I think did more harm than good. And I'm a pragmatist, and I do believe in racial equality, and I do believe in civil rights. I'm very, very strong on everyone should be treated equally, and there's a long way to go in eradicating, social injustice. Very, very quickly, that became a very divisive issue, and they spent far too much time in press conferences and far too much time, faffing around with that. Um, and it was a PR stunt that I think again distracted from a lot of good things the team were doing. And the best way to unite a society is, especially with sport, is at grassroots level, is with engagement, is with you know figuring out the issues that are a grassroots issue, a community issue. Um, so that'll be interesting. My next set of club histories. I've done Lincoln City today, because they're the highest ranked club, I suppose, or the highest league club in Lincolnshire. Done Grimsby, who are the second best club in Lincolnshire right now. Stockport County, no, not Stockport County. Done them. Uh, oh shit. Scunthorpe United is going to be my next one because they've just gone out of the Football League, and that's going to be very, very interesting. And then Boston United, obviously with their financial irregularities in the past. So I want to do all the clubs in Lincolnshire that have played in the Football League at a professional level, and that's not a lot. And then I'll do both Bristol clubs, I think, and then I'll obviously do Wigan Athletic because they have the envious title of being the first and only club to win an FA Cup and get relegated in the same season, which is fantastic. Which is I think they want another club to win the FA Cup and get relegated in the same season, so they're not the only ones. But Wigan Athletic are a very, very interesting club because they haven't been in the Football League that long, and they have been in existence as long as a lot of other clubs, and they play in Rugby League country, which is very, very interesting. I want to do like videos on Hull and Hartlepool, the rest of the Lancashire club. I don't really know. I like I like the clubs that I've done, as in the videos that I've done. I'm quite happy with how I've done them, but I think I could still do the club history videos a bit better. One thing that I'm very keen to do is not make them too long, so I don't do every single key moment in their histories. I try and keep them brief because I've noticed on the old data, audience retention. Scunthorpe United are in serious trouble. Let's not kid ourselves. They may go out of business if we're being honest. I mean, they could do a Torquay United. They could do a Chester. They could do a Hereford. Torquay United stayed in business just, and that was with the help of Exeter City and others to make sure they didn't completely disappear. But Torquay United haven't been back to the Football League. Oldham are another club that I think are in serious trouble of going down the pan. Rushton and Diamond. I think the next video I'm going to do when it comes to a club history or a video like that is looking at Rushton and Diamond, because their rise and fall and then their ceasing of existence. None of the fan base have gone, let's reform the club, let's band together and start the club up again. Rushton and Diamonds no longer exist, and that is something that, while they weren't in the Football League as long as, let's say, a Scunthorpe or a Torquay, is very, very interesting. This is something I think could happen to Forest Green Rovers if they overextend themselves, which I think Forest Green Rovers are actually doing, but that's personal opinion. But Scunthorpe United is going to be an interesting one, as is Oldham Athletic, because of their history within the game and the fact that especially Oldham were founders of the Premier League back in '92, and how far they've fallen in 30 years is terrifying. That really is mismanagement on an industrial scale. Is Oldham Athletic. The Rushton and Diamonds video that I'm going to do, I think, will be a little bit longer because there's a lot to look into with Rushton and Diamonds. There's a reason why the club are out of existence. Yeah, Hereford went out of business and reformed. So that Chester went out of business and reformed. AFC Wimbledon reformed. There are clubs that are Phoenix clubs, so to speak, but Rushden and Diamonds is going to be an interesting one. But I will look at Boston United as well because they haven't been back to the Football League. And I remember the early days of the FIFA games; they were a playable club. They it's going to be interesting. What do I think of the teams in the Super League and NRL Grand Finals? Leeds have been up and down, but I think I think St Helens do it again. For the NRL, I actually think Penrith are vulnerable, and Parramatta have beaten them twice this season. So it's 2-1 to Parramatta on the season and post-season, and Parramatta like winning 3 in a row. So they've won 2 in a row. And last year Penrith had to do it in 4 games. I think Parramatta, they've made the grand final. It's their 3rd grand final since they last won anything in '86. I think Parramatta are going to upset them. That's my opinion on the Parramatta. And I will do a preview of Penrith versus Parramatta, the NRL Grand Final. Obviously, we've just seen the AFL Grand Final with Geelong winning, and they won easily. They were the best team in the regular season. They smashed Sydney, the Sydney Swans. But as I said with the AFL, this week has been clouded by a lot of negative headlines and scandal, and I think the AFL has got a lot of cultural and structural problems. When I say cultural, I mean the win at all costs mentality. I think blue and yellow win both. I hope. Yes, yes. That'll be interesting if both clubs that win actually play in the same colours, because obviously the World Club Challenge, I think, is going to be resurrected. But look, we've only got a couple of weeks to go until England kick off the World Cup against Samoa, and that Samoan team looks like it's going to be stacked, absolutely stacked. So that's going to be a very, very interesting head-to-head. Um, Rugby league, I think, is coming out of a bad period, in my opinion, and this World Cup is going to be pivotal. The AFL, so in complete contrast, is going into a new era, and again, what happens now? So the successor to Gil McLaughlin at the AFL, and what happens with the Hawthorn Hawks external investigation in what is in that report is going to be crucial. Samoa and Tonga, yes, I mean they could be dark horses. New Zealand are clear favourites at this point. I think Australia are vulnerable. They're not they're not on the same level of the side that won in 2017. The rise of Tonga and the Samoan side that they're planning to put together is terrifying. I think Papua New Guinea are going to be dark horses to get further than the quarterfinals and win games away from home. It's going to be a very open tournament. I think England are not the team they were in 2017. I think the decline of the Super League is going to be seriously highlighted by this tournament. And I think delaying by a year has definitely given teams like Samoa and Tonga even more chance for those young players to develop. And those young players, because there's a loophole in our international selection rules, a lot of them have played state of origin now, and are still eligible to represent Tonga and Samoa in a World Cup year. So again, that's the International Rugby League's got to sort out the selection rules, because it does sort of make a mockery of well, you're born and raised in Australia or New Zealand, you've never lived in Samoa or Tonga. You've got the grandparent rule, as it basically is, or the parent grandparent rule. But if a new nation, because only 4 nations have ever won the World Cup: France, Great Britain / England, but basically Great Britain, basically England's side, Australia and New Zealand. And New Zealand, I think, are clear favourites for this tournament. And that is for me something. The racism and misogyny allegations on the Phoenix Suns and Phoenix Mercury, very similar to what's happening in the AFL. Very, very similar. I don't think he's involved in sport after this. It taints those organisations. It does taint, as I say, those organisations, which is unfortunate. I don't know what else to really say. The fact that 2 of the major sports leagues in their domestic countries in the NBA because of the Phoenix Suns. The Phoenix Mercury, I'm not overly clued up on the Phoenix Mercury, but the fact that a team owner basically is being forced to sell because of racism and sexism, basically, um, allegations, which that says to me there's a lot of proof and fact to them, which is what I fear with the AFL with the Hawthorn Hawks as well, with what's coming out in the AFL in the last 3 days, 4 days. Um, what was seen as acceptable, which really wasn't 30, 40 years ago. Look, I've always said this. I think we have come a long way since I was a kid in the early 90s. We have come a hell of a long way from where we were 25, 30 years ago, maybe even 40. As Western societies, we have come a hell of a long way. Unfortunately, there have in I would say in the last 5, 6 years, I think we've started to go backwards, and a lot of that's to do with the media and politics. The media spreading division that the populist politicians then spin off, and then that you know has created us versus them mentality, the divisions within society and within you know within within certain sectors of society in a said urban area, for example. Um, and it's troubling. But what's happening at the Phoenix Suns is also happening at the Hawthorn Hawks, except it was with coaches and the playing side of it, but also at board level. It's led to one of the AFL commissioners being stood down. Two coaches are currently suspended, or stood down, suspended, however you look at it, from their day-to-day jobs, although their teams did not make the latter stages of the AFL competition. On the flip side, the Hawthorn AFLW side were playing yesterday, and with what's going on at that club, then there have to be questions of the culture in general at the Hawthorn Hawks, not during their win, just you know. In regards to Robert Serber, I don't know enough about, as I say, North American Major League sports outside of the NHL to comment on his ownership and what's happened. But yeah, speculation, allegations have been surfacing and floating on social media and the mainstream media for a good couple of weeks. And yeah, it's not a good look, especially especially in the NBA, where a fair majority of your player base is from a minority group with Afro Caribbeans and African Americans. It's just not a good look to have an owner of your team basically being a racist, sexist figure. That's my viewpoint on it. If that is proven, but then if he has proven to have made these comments, then under law, he's broken the law by basically being discriminatory, which is a criminal offence. The fact that he owns, a team in Europe as well. What happens with La Liga and the Spanish FA and whether they, put pressure on him to sell up Mallorca is up in the air. There's a big debate about American money in European football anyway. With some of the comments that some of the American owners and some of the decisions some of the American owners have tried to do. We've seen how divisive North American ownership has been of football clubs. I think the only North American ownership group that's really got the fans on side and actually seem to be very popular even with fans of other clubs is Ryan Reynolds and Rob McElhenney. They're the ones who seem to come across as, okay, look, we'll inject the money into the team, but we'll let the football do the talking. We want to get to understand the culture of the sport. Every other American ownership group that I can think of seems so out of touch with fans. It's La Liga, it's Spain. It will look kind of awkward if because bearing in mind La Liga, especially La Liga wanted to take games to the US to sell the product. There is a big Latin American community in the US and Canada. The MLS is growing at a fast rate. La Liga games are broadcast in the US on ESPN and other networks. There is a TV deal in place. There's a big beIN Sports, for example, and NBC do broadcasts in Spanish. I think pressure will be applied to La Liga. There will be backlash from fans in the US of La Liga teams, not just Mallorca, against this owner. There will be pressure applied. the optics of La Liga at the moment with Barcelona and Real Madrid situations financially, the European Super League debacle. American fans didn't want it either. American owners in within football and American money within football in Europe is viewed quite negatively at the moment, I think. And a lot of the clubs involved with the European Super League, guess what? American owners, and they were all British. And it didn't look good. There's American ownership in Scottish football. There's American money in French football. There is a pushback, and what's happened with Robert Saba. I mean, look at the guy who owns the Washington NFL team, the Washington Commanders or whatever it is. Similar allegations against him for misconduct, and he's probably the most hated sports owner in North America. Um, there's been a lot of bad owners, in North American major league sports. I think the Liga may start feeling, pressure to sanction him, suspend him from operations, just because the instance that we know about or the allegations that we know about happened in Arizona doesn't mean stuff didn't happen in Spain. They just haven't come to light yet. Now, whether that's because of Spanish media laws or whistleblowing laws, privacy laws, etc., which are different to the US. Whether no complaints have been made to La Liga head office and the Spanish FA. Again, maybe because Mallorca aren't the most successful club in Spain, so they don't get the same media attention. There's a lot of reasons why maybe it's not making the news in Spain, but I think that eventually pressure will be applied, because to have that kind of negativity surround that negative press, but whatever he said, not good for Spanish football. The Spanish women team want the manager out. Yeah, look, Spanish football has problems. Yes, and racism is one of those issues that keeps rearing its ugly head. And look, the Spanish women's team, their performance at the Euros wasn't 100% convincing. But that's what you get when you've got a coach who's come through the Barcelona system, division within the locker room. Oh, we've seen this before with Spain. Even when they were winning with their ticky-tacky, I'd rather watch paint dry style, that may have been very effective, but wasn't necessarily the best advert for the game necessarily. People were saying, "Oh, finally, they figured out the locker room, they figured out the dressing room, they figured out how to unite the various factions." That isn't the case anymore. And while they got to the latter stages of Euro 2020, they weren't overly convincing for large portions of the tournament. It took a big, massive win over Slovakia to propel them into the knockout stage, and suddenly they found their form. But there were rumours circulating that the locker room was divided again. There was infighting between the Catalans and the Andalusians and the Castilians and the Basques, which has caused problems for Spanish football for decades. Yeah, I mean, look, Vinicius Junior, the podcast. Spain has this problem, and then you've got to look at the individual clubs and the mess that they find themselves in. It's not just Barcelona with bad culture and money problems. Valencia is another one. Real Madrid have got a lot of debts. They're claiming they're making profits, but they've got no money to pay players. Like there's something going on at Barcelona that UEFA are either deliberately turning a blind eye to, or literally it just proves how badly enforced financial fair play rules are. And how weak UEFA are when it comes to the governance of the game. Because some of the stories coming out of Barcelona and intimidation and how club presidents have acted. People who are defending Barcelona are fanboys, in my opinion. Like there is things, very bad rumours circulating about players being intimidated to take the pay cut or contract negotiations. How long did Aubameyang stay there? Not very long. Suddenly he's back in the Premier League. Admittedly, he's a Chelsea signing, and he went for very, very cheap, but he didn't stay at Barcelona very long, agitating for that move out of Arsenal. Some of the dealings with contracts, pay a play. I mean, Bordeaux have basically gone out of business because Barcelona still have not paid a penny on a transfer dating back to 2019. Money they were relying on to basically pay their tax bill to the French tax authorities. So there's things going on in Spanish football that do raise an eyebrow. I think the Spanish FA and the Liga are far too influential within the European game. A lot of their clubs were again behind the European Super League, and two of the clubs still involved are still attached to this toxic, flawed idea that fans don't want. Although a lot of fans seem to be on social media resigned to the fact it will happen. I see it in the comment section regularly that the European Super League will happen whether we like it or not. And that's another reason not to watch the club game. That's another reason to turn off. Like football has a way of shooting itself in the foot. A lot of sports do. Um, and I don't know. Yeah, look, don't get me wrong. I still am a fan of the sport. I just love it less. So if I was to do my top 5 or top 10 favourite sports, it wouldn't rank very, very highly anymore. It wouldn't probably be in the top 10. Um, and that's personal opinion. That's how I feel. I have really lost a connection with the sport. Um, yeah, no, I don't. I'm not as invested as I was. I've really lost my connection with the sport, and that's been happening throughout my mid to late 20s through to my mid 30s. I mean, I'm in my mid 30s now, so I am showing my age. I was born in the 80s. My love for football really did change even before the FIFA corruption allegations were proven and it was all out in the open. You could see something was off with that awarding of the World Cup to Qatar. And then we see all these match fixing allegations and corruption allegations coming out of various domestic leagues. And then we hear reports in Der Spiegel about um, widespread endemic corruption in the lower levels of the game. We've had, various corruption allegations with breaking transfer rules and breaking youth rules, which Man City and Chelsea were punished for and had transfer embargoes and various things. The financial fair play mess, the salary, some of the transfers and salaries. I think when football truly, I think for me, lost its way with me, was the Neymar transfer from Barcelona to PSG. That was the moment I just went, I'm done with this. This is not a sport I can really feel invested in anymore, because that was an obscene amount of money. Now we know why Barcelona did that deal, is they had no money, and that was the moment I went, I'm starting to fall out of love with this game. It's not the game I grew up watching, in the 90s and the early 2000s. The way the Champions League works now, and the UEFA coefficient really punishes the smaller teams that want to break through and break that ceiling. The European Super League, again, pure greed at this point, or pure desperation to plug the black holes that are in clubs' finances, whether they're just overspent and were just badly financially organised, or criminality, outright criminality, like we saw with Portsmouth, for example, and Sheffield Wednesday under Milan Mandrick. That was blatant corruption and fraud. How no one went to prison over that is ridiculous. And that then taints the reputation of managers like Harry Redknapp, who were beloved in the game. There is now a proportion of footballing fans who go, well, he's a crook. Sam Allardyce, with the way he basically said, this is how you get around football's rules in regards to transfers and youth players. This is how you break the rules and get extra cash unlicensed, tax-free money. Just have some brown paper. He basically, whether he would have been the right fit for the England job is irrelevant. His son has been involved in multiple corruption allegations. Mike Newell basically got blacklisted by football for basically saying, this is how corrupt agents are. This is how corrupt the system is. And he was basically spilling the beans on not just English football, but football in general. This is how corrupt it is. Nearly 2 decades ago. Basically, he's had a few managerial and assistant managerial jobs since, but nothing as high profile as trying to get Luton Town into the Premier League at the time. He's basically been blacklisted and shunned by the majority of clubs. Look, I would love to see that in Qatar. I would love to see, players basically, bringing politics into it. I think it would really show FIFA up. It would embarrass the Qatari authorities, but then the Qatari authorities like beheading people and mutilating people for being gay. This is why the World Cup should have never gone there, because this is a country that restricts human rights for minorities and women. But again, FIFA at the time, like football in general, like chase the like sports in general, didn't care where the money came from. This is why and we can discuss human rights of even in countries in the West. Okay, we the UK, France, Spain, Italy, we've all got our human rights abuses historically. We can't keep digging up the past, and we've made massive, massive progress, at least in Europe, and in the Commonwealth and the former European colonies around the world that are democracies today. Yeah, massive, massive progress has been made in a lot of countries. But as we've seen with the AFL and what's coming out about the Hawthorn Hawks and what's coming out about the Adelaide camp, or was it Port Adelaide in 27? I think was it Adelaide Power or Port Adelaide, the 2017 team building camp and the allegations of racism and all that kind of unnecessary Neanderthal shit, as I call it. There's only one race, the human race, and stigmatizing someone because of the color of their skin is the most illogical and knuckle dragging crap you could ever come up with. It stuns me that in 2022 we are still discussing human rights, racism, homophobia, all this crap. Now, I think there are better ways to get your message across. Just don't go to the World Cup. There you go. So all those teams that will be at the World Cup, therefore, are saying we're okay with restricting human rights and just don't go, just boycott. It'd be more embarrassing for FIFA if a huge swathe of players, especially players of colour or from minority backgrounds, it's a better way to look at it. Players who, imagine if Neville Southall was still playing today, he would not go because he's very, very famously stood up for women's rights, sex worker rights, LGBT rights. Neville Southall, if he was the Welsh goalkeeper, if Wales had qualified, if Neville Southall was playing today in the goal for Wales, he'll be one of the players who wouldn't be going. I have no, because of what he's done campaigning for civil rights issues here in the UK for the best part of 3 decades, he would not be on that plane. Let that sink in. And where you can go, yeah, I like or hate Neville Southall because he played for Everton, whatever, Neville Southall, what he's done outside of football for women's rights, sex worker rights, LGBT rights for decades. I could see him as one of those players who would deliberately wear the rainbow armband and would probably boycott, in my opinion. Oh, look, FIFA, I think, have already damaged their reputation with the corruption scandal, with what happened, and they could have stripped World Cup Qatar off, but they chased the money, and now Qatari money's in club football. PSG, TV money's in Qatari's TV money's involved in football now. So, and now they've chased the Saudi money. I mean, but they wouldn't give Morocco a World Cup, but they give it to the US and Canada and Mexico. Even Mexico and the US have obviously got the drug war going on the US border with Mexico, and in Mexico, political violence daily. The US, I mean, race relations are at an all-time low in the modern era. In the last 30 years, I've got worse. I mean, the LA riots, I actually vaguely remember the LA riots, but they're going there. But it's double-edged sword. They've chasing blood money, like real blood money. They can't back out of it because now not only have they're trying to court Saudi Arabia for a possible World Cup bid. They've taken the Qatari money. They've now allowed Qatari money into club football, be it club ownership or TV deals. And the human rights record is not good. But now look what we're seeing, and look what's happening in Iran. This is a country that bans women from going to football matches, yet they're allowed to qualify for the World Cup. They're not on the outer like the Russians are for having a conflict with Ukraine. Look what's happening in Tehran right now, and the violent repression of those protests. There's no freedom of expression in Iran, but they still allow Iran to qualify. So there's a lot of double standards here, saying that we're all for equality. Yeah, Iran is not suspended from FIFA because of its human rights record in regards to women and minorities. Saudi Arabia and Qatar. It's because of the money. And it's going to be interesting if I imagine if like an openly gay player comes out on the eve of the World Cup and then what does his coach not select him to go? Like, this is the moment that a gay player comes out and says, "If you don't select me to go, that what message does that send? That you are in fear? What?" So we'll see what happens. This is where politics and sport is not a good thing, and yeah, it's now become a complete and utter shambles, in my opinion. I think, but we've got enough problems domestically in the domestic leagues with the hooligan element, and the social media element, which is very toxic, that we saw after the Euros, and we've seen with Harry Maguire last season with the bomb threat, and the Mason Greenwood situation, how it got leaked onto social media, which it shouldn't have been, which then put pressure on the authorities to act. There's a lot of things domestically we need to get right. I remember watching when Sepp Blatter announced Qatar. Oh, look, my view on football was already changing at that point. It was. Um, I haven't been able to afford to go to a game in a very, very long time. And, I mean, I haven't been to a live sporting venue since before COVID. So, yeah, COVID's had an impact on that. But I can't justify even going to an ice hockey match now. And a lot of my friends are ice hockey mad, and it's a lot cheaper. And I've got some time off in November and December where I could go see some games, for example. But I can't justify the expense. And this is another thing, is the price. We were told that, with TV deals, and back in 2016, I remember doing a video, a live stream mentioning this, when the Premier League clubs basically said, "Oh, we can let the fans in for nothing, or a tenner, because the TV money." How much of a lie was that when COVID hit and they've got no income, and then they also play in front of empty stadiums? They're like, "We need a handout. We need handouts. We've got to furlough staff. We can't afford." So they were cooking the books, before COVID. Money has definitely distorted the sport. Um, there is the haves and the way the system is set up is very, very rigged, um, in a sense. Where this is, and the UEFA coefficient doesn't help because it's actually devalued leagues, made the leagues much less competitive. A whole host of things. And the financial imbalance means clubs overextend themselves just to try and put the best team on the field they can to try and win anything. Um, and the clubs that keep winning all the time, ironically, are saddled with debt, and COVID exposed that. When they're saying, "Oh, this is our revenue or our profits for the year," is that pre or post tax? Because a lot of them aren't actually making money, because we now know that they are getting to the eyeballs. And what the price is, it depends if you're watching the elite league or the national league, really, or if you want to watch, the real amateur game, the lower levels. It not too bad. Cheaper than football, let's just say that. The overall experience is more family orientated. Obviously, the salaries for players are peanuts in comparison to even League Two, what League Two players get. So the players aren't in it for the money in this country. Let's just say that. Obviously, Liam Kirk getting drafted by Arizona in 2018 has sort of changed the dynamic, and they missed him at the World Championships this year with his knee injury. They were still really gave as good as they got in the World Championships. They were just outclassed. But I think we'll bounce back at first attempt. The most I'd pay for an ice hockey ticket is £15. So there you go, 15 quid, most I've ever paid for a single ticket. When I was taking my brother, because he was still at school, he was a concession. He got in for pennies. He got in for a couple of quid. The most I paid on a night for a group for three of us going was about 35 quid, because he could get deals. Not expensive. It's not expensive at all. I'm assuming prices are going to go up with the cost of living and inflation and the economic situation right now, but not overly expensive. I would think the nearest professional team to you would be Milton Keynes or Peterborough. If you're up in Hertford, Milton Keynes or Peterborough. And that's not bad. I mean, the Peterborough Phantoms and the Milton Keynes Lightning are good organisations, and very solid fan bases, very good organisations, constantly producing local talent that go on to higher levels. I mean, Milton Keynes have been in the Elite League. good pathways, good facilities, good infrastructure, um, and not bad teams to follow if you're local. Then you have got teams in the Greater London area, obviously. They'll be if you're living in Hertford, they'll be the teams I would suggest. Maybe Slough and the Bees Ice Hockey Club, which now play out of Slough. So they would be the teams I would suggest if you are from Hertford, you consider following. Um, I think yes, the media deal, the TV deal could be better. But ice hockey is the fastest growing sport in this country. This is where I think the British mainstream media has really undervalued the sport badly, and there is an opportunity to really grow the game in this country that's been missed badly over the last 10 years because it's growing rapidly anyway. But imagine if you've got mainstream attention from Sky or BT Sport or BBC, it could be a much higher level than it actually is, and a much bigger, exposure than it currently gets. I mean, there is a solid fan base in this country. There's a good youth system in this country. It is producing talent, um, but it definitely deserves a bit more investment and a better media presence. And the mainstream media in this country's coverage is crap. Quite honestly, it's crap. But hopefully Liam Kirk, hopefully his knee injury, he's recovered from the surgery and he has a good training camp with Arizona and maybe makes the roster. If he makes the roster, that'd be fantastic. I do think he will get some NHL game time at some point. Arizona are in a rebuild, so I wouldn't be surprised if he does get a call up to get some game time, burn a year of his contract, maybe not burn a year of his, but we just don't know. Hopefully, at Tucson Roadrunners, he has a good season in the AHL as well, in bouncing back from that injury. And hopefully, he does get some NHL games and maybe get some exposure, and maybe a trade to a team that's developing better or at a better level. But that was a big shot in the arm for the game here in the UK was getting. I've seen him play. He's a fantastic player. I don't think he was quite ready to play against men when he first, got to senior level, but he's developed into quite a good player. His performances last year at the World Championships were exemplary. He was the top goal scorer, so I do think I think he will get some NHL time. Probably, I think he's seen it could possibly be a third liner in the NHL, but given the right teammates and the right combinations, he could do very, very well. But I think AHL is more his level right now, and of course, losing 9 months of your career to a knee injury that's a blow. That's hard to come back from. But I think he's more than capable of taking that step. There we go. But no, in regards to the Qatar announcement all those years ago, it was a very shocking moment. I think that's when a lot of questions were raised at the time and in the months following about that World Cup, and then of course, not that long ago, they were like, "Oh, it's going to be a winter tournament," and then the head scratching of how we're going to structure the season around that. And of course, we've got to suspend league play for that period of time, and it's definitely left a stain on FIFA. I think this is the moment, and then what we've seen with UEFA and CONMEBOL and FIFA at loggerheads over a variety of things, and then the suggestion we might go to a 2-year World Cup cycle, which then completely devalues the Euros and the Copa America. And then we've seen the rise of the Nations League because of the criticism of the pointless friendlies we now have, and the way they've tried to structure the international calendar. And then COVID really has caused a lot of headaches as well. But football governance and club governance, the club game and the international game is quite frankly in an administrative mess, and it has been for a long, long time. And I look at the club histories and look at the club. Yeah, they won't do the same with the Ashes. I mean, look, the Ashes has been overplayed to death. That rivalry has lost all significance for me now. And both Australia and England do have massive issues within their domestic games. Both Australia and England are not the sides they were. And again, that's Cricket Australia and the ECB chasing quick money. And now we're looking at the review that the ECB have done into trying to fix the domestic game. And what players are saying is, we don't want the 100. Clubs are saying, we don't want the 100. When you've got superstar players like Ben Stokes going, I can't play the short formats anymore. I'm burning out, and he's an international captain. That tells you that the 100 is a bad idea, and he was their big selling point. So the ECB, that was a knee-jerk reaction to set up the 100. I'm not sold on it. I never have been. I don't think it's the long-term solution to the problems that domestic cricket faces. I think the TV deal is. I think the obsession with the subscription TV services, basically copying the Australian structure, has not worked at all. And I think the Australians have the same issues over there as well. We've seen a lot of scandals in both Australian and English cricket in recent years as well that have damaged the public image, player misbehaviour. The laddish drinking culture is still a thing. The Ben Stokes and Alex Hales trial, for example, especially the Ben Stokes. Well, Alex Hales never actually made it to trial, and I think he was just as guilty of what occurred that night in Bristol. What we've seen with the culture within the sport, a lot of negative headlines coming out about what happened in the past and currently. You know, there are a lot of question marks over how the direction the sport's taking, the culture within the sport. And now we look what's happened with golf, with the LIV and the PGA. Basically, and unfortunately, in my opinion, the players don't look good at coming out of this. A lot of the players have really damaged their reputations because they're already well compensated if they do well. And Ian Poulter, his response to the question of, "So you're happy to take blood money then?" That was basically what the journalist was saying, and he had no answer. He's gone Mickelson and Poulter, Lee Westwood. I've never liked Lee Westwood. They've really golfers don't help themselves. Golf has an image problem. It really does. I've got nothing against professionalism and earning as much money as possible and being well compensated, but some of the figures that are being touted in golf is ridiculous. It's already a sport with an image problem anyway. Um, the LIV, it's Greg Norman versus the PGA basically, because Greg Norman has had his own personal fallout with the PGA years ago. And yeah, cricket is not the same. The World Cup proved that with the viewership figures that were on a 10 million plus drop in just casual fans and hardcore fans. That lack of free to air access during the World Cup, when England obviously go on to win it. I mean, what more do you want me to say? Rugby league's in the same boat. I think there is pushback against the subscription. Accessibility is key to growing a sport and having a healthy sport. I think there's too much money floating around in too few hands. The promises of the money filtering down to the lower levels is just a lie we've been sold. The 100 is not the solution to cricket's problems. The LIV format is not the solution to golf's problems. The TV deal is part of the problem. The greed of the players is part of the problem. The selfish attitude is part of the problem. And I think the PGA is also part of the problem. Why can't there be just a single governing body and a world tour sorted out? I don't know. But golf has got a lot of problems with its governance, and the fact that it's basically no longer a free to air sport tells you all you need to know about the state of golf and the contempt for the fans. It's not a working class sport. It never really has been, really. It's a sport that's still got a long way to go in regards to equality with female players and fans, well, women in general. There are still some clubs that are male only. What will happen to the PGA Well, look, I don't think the LIV is sustainable, quite frankly, and I'm not even sure fans are getting a rough deal either way because the sport is not as successful as it was a decade ago. Golf used to be a staple on the BBC. Augusta used to be all 4 days, uninterrupted, all 4 days. Every single player, you could watch every single player play their rounds. The Open, all 4 days, except it's not the thing anymore. And A-List, the former commentator who passed away a couple of years ago, was left shattered by the decision that the BBC was going to reduce coverage of golf. I don't care if the LIV and the PGA continue their little spat of who's got the more money to throw around and you know more to them. Let them take the blood money because, in my opinion, golf died for me a long time ago. Um, it's not as accessible as it should be. It's not a sport that is accessible to everyone. Um, and it is seen as a sport that is stereotypically predominantly white, predominantly male, and predominantly middle and upper class. So there's already a barrier put in front of people from working class backgrounds, minority backgrounds, and women. That's what I feel about golf. And there's going to be people who defend it to the hill. But in my opinion, greed. I don't care. I don't care what happens to the PGA or LIV. I don't care. A lot of golfers have gone down in my estimation. A lot of them are hypocrites. And if they're willing to take the sports wash blood money, then so be it. Because, quite frankly, golf alongside boxing and MMA and a lot of other sports, I don't care. I could do a lot of coverage on Tiger Woods' career and how many majors he's won. I could do coverage on UFC, boxing, whatever. But they're not sports I care about anymore. I really don't. They've become a circus. Yet people keep, buying the crap, keep feeding, keep feeding. When are people going to realise that, stop buying the product? They'll quickly change their structures and you may see it become a more open sport, more accessible. Stop feeding the greed. Simple solution. Stop feeding the greed. And with the current economic climate and cost of living crisis, I've had to make some choices. I've had to cut back. And, I might have to start selling some of my sports memorabilia that I've spent many, many years collecting and I've enjoyed collecting. I might have to start selling some of it. That's the situation a lot of people find themselves. I cannot afford to go to a football match. I can't afford to go to a rugby match. I was hoping I might go to the Rugby League World Cup at the Emirates when the game. I think it's a semi-final. The tickets are reasonably affordable. It's whether the trains are going to run because of all the planned strikes. If the World Cup took place last year, I could afford to go. This year, I'm not so sure. So, while I love doing what I do for the channel, and I love covering the sports that I cover, and I'm very passionate about sport, and I could do more videos on golf. I could look at player profiles and look at Tiger Woods. When he does decide to retire, I will do a video on Tiger Woods. I think he deserves that. I think I need to do a video on Roger Federer. Um, and his career, and Arnold Palmer, Jack Nicklaus, and Gary Player. I don't know. I honestly don't know. They were seen as mavericks in their own day and in their own right. They were seen as trailblazers, and how they played the game and their kind of character. I'm not so sure. Would Sevi Ballesteros go, for example? The late great. I think, unfortunately, what has happened with golf, as a lot of other sports, is greed. It happened with the Super League war when it came to rugby league, which, as we now know, has not benefited rugby league in Europe. And the NRL is still sort of trying to fix the problems with the dual venture clubs that, quite frankly, aren't very successful. I know they've won premierships, both St George, Illawarra, and West Tigers, but they've not been great for a very long time. That's divided boardrooms. And excluding South Sydney led to protests. the NRL is still sort of trying to figure itself out, and then go back a bit further and look at the WHA and the NHL. Very similar to what LIV are doing right now with golf, throwing masses of money around that they can't justify. That ends up almost bankrupting the sport. Um, and it then led to problems years down the line with lockouts, salary caps having to be introduced, and changes to player contracts, and there was a lot of issues that ice hockey has had to recover from over the last 40 years. They've had, and still there are lingering issues with trust between players and the league, and arbitration rights, and salary caps, and all escrow that were happening in the 70s. The NFL has basically killed every rival American football league there is. You know, there are parallels in history with what's happening with golf right now, and the rival league is never really successful. It generally fails within a short time because it cannot sustain the money that's been thrown around. Now, can this Saudi-backed LIV golf really be a success, or what is there a lot of debt behind it? We just don't know the actual. They're just throwing money around as if it's going out of fashion. It'll be interesting to see the actual global viewership figures after the first full year of its existence, and what then happens with the majors like the Open and Augusta, whether these players are actually barred from participating in these major tournaments. Are they barred from the Ryder Cup? Because if the tournament organisers are going, well, no PGA or LIV players are eligible to enter, it's all going to be all amateurs this year. That'd be very, very interesting. There is something, that it's going to be very, very interesting what happens with, for example, Augusta National and the Open, and whether what percentage of LIV players who've decided to go over to the Revel Tour actually participate in those competitions, because those majors are seen as the holy grails, of golf. Augusta and the Open are seen as the holy grails of golf, and if they are barred from participating in those tournaments, those events, that could be the moment where we see whether the LIV is going to continue long term or not. If the tournament organisers of Augusta and the Open say, if you're in the LIV or PGA or whatever, this continues, we're going to start barring players. We're going to say you are eligible for selection to come in. That might be the moment, which brings both sides around the table to form a global governing body for golf that is international. One single governing body, one single tour, because you've got the Asian Tour, the European, and the PGA, right? Get one single tour globally. That might be the moment, but we'll see what happens. I fear for golf's long-term future. It's not a sport that's diverse enough for me. In reality, it seems a sport that is not reaching working class people, because there's a lot of working class people who are golf fans. I have no doubt on that. But it's a sport that seems very, very exclusive, driven by greed, and still has issues with representation and participation from minority groups, and women still face a lot of hurdles with the sport as well. Are not overly welcomed, I don't think. I think there's still resistance to the female game and female participation. So golf is a sport that's archaic in its player base and fan base, and I think is slowly killing itself. And I think this battle between the PGA and LIVs, and that's Greg Norman basically, and the PGA is definitely causing more harm than good at a time when there needs to be unity within the golfing world, and maybe a little less greed and a bit more player unity, and going, we need an overall single tour, single governing body. That's the solution, I think. And I think that's the end outcome. Is there'll be a single governing body at the end of the day. It needs it. It's a sport that needs it. Same with boxing. It's a sport that needs a single governing body. But boxing and golf have definitely, for me, not sports that I have any major attachment to anymore or joy in. Even though most of the videos on this channel and most of the, a lot of the content is football based on this channel. Um, I hope with the Rugby League World Cup in a couple of weeks that the channel grows on the back of Rugby League content. And then obviously next year we've got the Rugby Union World Cup, and again I hope that growth continues with other sports getting a big say. And of course, I'll do a video on Roger Federer and his career now that he's decided to retire from tennis and he's played his last match. Because I think looking at Roger Federer's career and the success he's had, it would be fantastic. And you know, breaking down his career by years, and of course he's not been as successful in obviously recent years, and age has caught up with him. But there you go. Yes, of course. Rugby League, Rugby Union. It goes back to 1895, and the argument over professionalism, because more of the northern teams that were playing rugby, because it was rugby at the time, had more working class players, and they had day jobs, and if they were injured, they couldn't work, and therefore they couldn't put food on the table. Whereas a lot of the southern teams were from middle and upper class players who were mostly university students or were landed gentry, so they had independent wealth, and therefore, if they were injured, it wasn't the end of the world because they were the manager of the factory or they were the manager of the bank rather than the bank clerk. So there was a meeting in Huddersfield in 1895, and the Northern Rugby Football Union, as it was known at the time, the Northern Union, as it was known at the time, broke away. And it was mostly clubs from Yorkshire, although clubs from Lancashire, Cheshire, and Cumberland, as it is now, the Carlisle area, obviously, would join them in time. And then, as time went on, they got rid of the line-out. Initially it was still 15 players a side, then it became 13 a side, and then the rules take a divergent path. And rugby union didn't turn professional until 1995, where players were paid to play. Officially, even though unofficially, basically, there were ways round, amateur status. So rugby league, if you look at the Super League clubs and then all the clubs in the professional and semi-pro ranks in the English Super League or European Super League structure, the majority of the teams are from the M62 corridor in the north of England. Majority. It's the reason why the London Broncos and London Scholars are where they are. The London Broncos originally started out as Fulham Rugby League Football Club in the 1980s, before becoming known as the London Broncos in the early 90s. And then obviously being a Super League club from 95. But predominantly most of the clubs involved in the Super League structure are from the north of England, even though the French clubs are all from the same region of France. PSG did have a team for a couple of years. It wasn't very successful. Now, when we're talking about World Cups, you've got the Rugby League World Cup, and then you have the Rugby World Cup. Now, the Rugby World Cup next year in 2023 in France is Union, and the Rugby League World Cup is Rugby League this year. Obviously, in England, it was maybe played last year, COVID delayed. So you've got two different World Cups. The difference is Rugby League, 13 aside with 4 interchange players plus an 18th man should there be 3 concussions or an active foul play that results in the player getting injured and the other player being sanctioned either with a sin bin or a send-off. Rugby Union, the benches, the replacements bench is that replacements. It's not interchange. It's replacements or finishers, as Eddie Jones likes to call them, subs bench, much like in football. Still 15 aside. They still have the line out. The ruck and maul is completely different. The ruck in rugby league has evolved into literally the tackle zone and the play the ball, whereas the ruck in rugby union is still. I've got a video on rugby union explained for beginners. I've got to do a rugby league video, but rugby league is far easier to understand when you actually watch it and watch a few games. If you watch the Rugby League World Cup basically next month and in November, you'll see how much easier the sport is. Just watch as many games as you can, and it will start making a lot of sense to new viewers. And of course, the great thing is we've got the Women's World Cup taking place at the same time, and the Wheelchair Rugby League World Cup taking place at the same time this year. So there's a lot of rugby league to watch, which is fantastic. There's some new nations playing, like Greece and Jamaica. Again, fantastic. And actually, that Greece side looks pretty competitive, as does the Jamaica side. Looks pretty decent quality for the level that they play at. They've got some good players. So you've got the two World Cups, which rugby league. It's obviously the Rugby League World Cup, and the Rugby World Cup is Rugby Union, governed by World Rugby, formerly the International Rugby Board. Yeah, Rugby League's been professional for longer, so the players have been paid to play since 1895. So that's interesting. But the most of the rugby league professional clubs in Europe play in southwest France, which is their traditional heartland of rugby league, and in the north of England, Yorkshire, Lancashire, and now Cumbria, basically, and a few clubs in Cheshire, is the majority of professional teams. Now, in Australia, it's the East Coast, so Victoria, New South Wales, and Queensland, where the game is at its strongest. Their split and formation was in 1908. 1907, 1908 is when rugby league decides in the Southern Hemisphere to split from rugby union and go its own way and follow the rugby league rules that we've had since 1895. And the New South Wales Rugby League, as it was known, is born. Obviously, all Sydney teams at the time. As time goes on, teams outside Sydney obviously join the competition, like the Brisbane Broncos, the Canberra Raiders, and the Newcastle Knights. And then the Super League rule happens, and then we have teams in Perth and Adelaide and in Northern Queensland, the Cowboys, Auckland with the New Zealand Warriors. The modern NRL was born in 1998. The league shrinks a bit, then expands again. Obviously, the Melbourne Storm are still going as that initial baby NRL club. But there are plans to get a team back in Perth, possibly. We're seeing expansion now with the Redcliffe Dolphins. We've still got to beat the Warriors. Adelaide hasn't been discounted. Another team in New Zealand hasn't been discounted as the 18th team. But AFL, yes, AFL, the Tasmania situation. I've been following the Tasmania situation with the AFL and whether they're going to have a permanent 19th team in Tasmania. And whether they put another team in North Queensland or Darwin to truly make it a national competition, because TV viewership, ironically, NRL is now ahead. Fans and attendance, the AFL is still more popular. TV revenue, however, and TV viewership, the NRL is bigger. Plus, the NRL has state of origin. So there is that. Yes, I do believe rugby league, there is a solid player base in Western Australia. I think around the Perth area. They do take games to Darwin. They do take state of origin to Adelaide and Perth as well. Tasmania is Aussie rules cricket country. That's a fact. Always will be. I think the opportunity to grow the game there is long since past the NRL and Australian Rugby League by. But my friend Matt, who sadly passed away last year, he had a congenital heart illness and he had a few other health issues as well. But he'd been very ill for a long time. He lived in Melbourne. He wasn't really sold on either Aussie rules or rugby league. He was sort of indifferent because he was born over here, actually, ironically, and he moved to Australia when he was young, but he kept coming back to the UK quite regularly. He was sort of what I called our lost colonial, as I used to say. He was a very good friend of mine, and I wouldn't be here today if it wasn't without my friend Matt and his support. I do actually mean that with a lot of love. He lived in Australia for a long time. He was the last, decade or so of his life. He was actually living in Germany with his partner Sina, but he still has his Anglo-Australian roots. And we would generally discuss, the AFL and the NRL. He was more of a boxing fan and a football fan, really. soccer to Aussies. Um, but we still had that discussion about the AFL and the NRL, and he was quite right that the NRL does have fans outside of Queensland, New South Wales, and Victoria. It does have national fans, which is where when they take the games on the road, it really does work, and they get really good crowd numbers. But the AFL, I think, is an interesting one. The Tasmania situation could backfire on them. There's no clarity on are they going to relocate a team? Are they going to have an expansion team? Are they going to end up in the Northern Territory, get a team there? Are they going to put another team in Perth or Adelaide? Which Perth seems more likely that will be where the next team goes after Tasmania. But what's come out with the AFL this week with the Hawthorn Hawks, and what's actually these regular incidents of historical bullying, racism, and misconduct within the game, especially what's happening at Hawthorn right now, and what's obviously come out about the Adelaide, and I don't remember if it was Port Adelaide or Adelaide training camp in 2017, is quite concerning. And I started the live stream discussing the Hawthorn Hawks scandal. I will do a video on that, most likely tomorrow, because I'll be watching the Prime Minister's 13 versus PNG games and the women's final series, and the NRLW is starting tomorrow. And I want the Newcastle Knights and Sydney Roosters to be the final, actually, because that would be quite interesting with the amount of ex-players on both sides who are playing in either team, and my favourite player plays for the Newcastle Knights women's team, so there is that. With what's happened with the AFL this week, that I think has overshadowed the grand final, and with how the AFL, I think Hawthorn did the right thing by commissioning their independent review and making sure that looking after players in retirement is key. But with what's come out with being linked to the press and how the AFL sat on that report for a week before doing anything, really, publicly at least, I think the AFL's got to be very, very careful how they handle this. I think they've handled it well so far. I think they could handle it a bit better in hindsight. Obviously, Gil McLaughlin's on the way out as CEO of the AFL. This is his end last year, and at the end of the year, he's done. But this is whoever comes in to replace him. That's going to be some a big scandal to deal with. Now, Gil McLaughlin came in following the peptide scandal at Essendon, and his replacement is going to be coming in following what's happening at the Hawthorn Hawks and at other clubs. So the AFL does have an issue, and I think it's replicated in wider society in Australia. I think we can all agree on that. I think wider society in general. I do agree that we also have come a very, very long way from where we were when I was a kid in the 90s, both here in the UK and in Australia and New Zealand. But we'll have to see what happens now. But in regards to the TV deals, I think COVID's had an impact on them. I think Peter V'landys and Andrew Abdo have done great things with the NRL in regards to their media rights deal. And the viewership figures actually back that up, and the fans in attendance actually back that up as well. The NRL has actually had more fans in attendance this season than in 2019, the last season before the COVID pandemic. The TV deals in place. The AFL's got 2 extra teams at the moment, so you've got more fixtures that are going to be played. And obviously next year, the NRL gains a team, and I think before the AFL expands to 19 teams, the NRL is going to have 18 teams. Now, what is interesting is the TV viewership battle. The NRL is more watched on TV, so that says to me that in the wider fan base is, for example, are the Sydney Swans and the Brisbane Lions, Gold Coast Suns really attracting a great TV audience on the East Coast, and in the rest of Australia, what if they were to do it by state and territory? What are the TV? Is it apart from Melbourne, really, which is the heartbed? Sydney's obviously the heartbed for rugby league, traditional heartbeds, Victoria, New South Wales. What are the viewership figures actually like in each major urban area and state and territory around Australia? Tasmania clearly has AFL. AFL's won there for fandom, obviously. We know that. The NRL is never going to go to Tassie. So that market is the AFL's market to really screw up, basically. And I think they're doing the best job to make a mess out of that expansion as possible, in my opinion. But yeah, like the TV deal that the AFL's just signed, I think that is on the back of future expansion. The fact that they've already got more teams than the NRL. The grand final gets more fans in attendance because it's a bigger stadium. The fact also the overseas TV deal, very interesting, and I do mention North America in this. I really do. Now the NRL is planning to take games to the US as well, and that's interesting. The AFL and the NRL have had really good viewership figures over in North America following the restart of play in 2020. Now, the NRL led the lead in starting the league up first, but the AFL and the NRL have had a surge in popularity with new fans and even existing fans in North America, obviously predominantly in the US. And you look at the amount of YouTubers who are reacting to the NRL and the AFL, who've obviously never watched it before or have a limited understanding of rugby league or rugby in general, which is a fast growing sport in the US. Um, I don't know. I agree. Melbourne is not a rugby league city. I mean, I've seen enough interviews with Melbourne Storm players to go, we can walk around and not really have the same harassment we would get in Sydney or Auckland or Brisbane. That is fact. And the AFL players say the same in Sydney. They can be pretty anonymous in Sydney and Canberra, where Great Western Sydney obviously play out their games out of Canberra, even though they're meant to be Greater Western Sydney. And Brisbane Lions players can happily go incognito pretty much with their day-to-day non-playing or non-training days when they're with shopping with their families, for example, or just relaxing, having a cup of coffee, or in the off season, they can relax. I'm not saying that Melbourne is a rugby league city. I'm just saying, you know, but I've been a fan of Australian AFL and NRL for most of my life. I think it's partly because one of my mum's friends when I was growing up, well, actually, one of my mum's boyfriends spent a year actually working in Australia. I've got friends who live in Australia. I've got friends from Australia. I was very lucky that my dad, being in the armed forces, he did travel the world quite a bit. I mean, we lived abroad for a while. That's where my love of the NHL comes from. Is my dad spent a lot of times going to Canada on NATO training exercises with Canadians, and also in Europe when we were based in Germany. There were a lot of Canadian service personnel who lived on the base with us and their families. So that's where I sort of developed my love of ice hockey from. It's not the fact that my local town where I lived used to have the national champions back in the late 90s, 2000. My love of ice hockey predates predates that. Is my dad would go away on training exercises with Canadian and other NATO forces like the US, and there'll be a lot of ice hockey fans in the services, and they would get discounted or free tickets to NHL and AHL games when they were out in Canada or out in the US, or vice versa, German league games, and we used to watch it together on TV. So I've been watching Aussie rules and NRL and NHL for 25, 29 years, something like that. Most of my life since I was like 3, 4 years old. I'm now nearly 33. In regards to what's happened this week with the AFL, yes, I should have watched the grand final day. It was actually few people were actually streaming it live on YouTube. Naughty. And I think I will get an AFL subscription on the AFL website from this coming next season. I'll be able to afford it as well as my NRL subscription, so I'll have both NRL and AFL subscriptions from next year. I think I will justify it. I did watch the South Sydney Penrith game. I think Parramatta now are the dark horses. I actually want to see Parramatta win. I think Parramatta have the tactics to beat Penrith. Penrith didn't look convincing in the game. I know they win the game. I know South Sydney end up with a player sent off and end up with 12 players. And Jai Arrow looks like he's picked up an injury. Again, that groin problem. Latrell Mitchell didn't look right. Especially with the Brian Toto intercept try, where he forces the pass. He's chasing back. He did not look right. He doesn't look like he's got pace. So I'm not sold on the Latrell Mitchell being 100% fit this season. I know he spent a long time in the US getting, sorting out his hamstrings and knee problems. But Latrell Mitchell to me does not look right. I think South Sydney do have a problem where they can't get past this semi. I know they got to got to the grand final last year, but they get to this point and then stop. Much like Parramatta getting to the finals but not progressing. Parramatta have finally gone right. We've got the monkey off our back. We've made it past the second week. And Parramatta had basically done what Penrith did last year. They lost the first game and then blasted out the last two games. Parramatta, South Sydney, I think, have the biggest global fan base, the Rabbitohs. I mean, even in the UK, I've seen Rabbitohs jerseys at just in day-to-day life, in going around London, because of the Russell Crowe link there. South Sydney there are South Sydney fans all over the US. Again, social media. Just look up on social media. Every time any sporting event, there were South Sydney Rabbitohs fans at the Super Bowl this year and last year. Parramatta, though, yeah, they have a massive fan base. They could quite easily fill out CommBank, formerly Westbank, the new Parramatta Stadium 4, 5, 6 times over every weekend if they wanted to, just out of fans in Sydney alone. Parramatta, I think Parramatta could definitely do it. I've always had a soft spot. I want to see Parramatta do well, even though I'm a Raiders fan. I want to see the Eels do well. I think they always have fantastic kits as well. But I've been to 2 grand finals in my lifetime and lost them both. This is grand final number 3. I think they can do it. I think they've shown in recent seasons that they've got the number on Penrith and Melbourne, for that matter. They've got a good recent record against both Melbourne and Penrith. They've done the double on them both in the regular season. Yes, they lost that opening weekend finals match against Penrith, but guess what happens? Mitch Moses got basically poleaxed in that game. It was close up until that instant, and they won both regular season games. They showed, I think last season they won the game going into the finals against Penrith as well. Yeah, no, I think Parramatta are actually going to do a number on Penrith in the grand final next weekend. Penrith didn't look right today for large portions of the game. South didn't look 100% either, but that's my opinion on the game. I think how the game. I mean, look, the NRL has been very, very clear. They want to take games to the US. They wanted to have the South's Dragons match up as the game they sold. Oh look, I think Mitch Moses is underrated. He gets a lot of flack, but he's like the Peter Sterling of his day, where he's great in the regular season and obviously great in finals as well. There's no doubt that he really does play 110% every game. It hasn't worked at Origin level, I don't think. He's only had the one game. He played most of that game with a broken back, as we now know. He gets a lot of abuse on social media, a lot of crap from fans, which I think is unfair. But I like Paramount. Bearing in mind that I think this is their last window. With the current squad they have, this is their window's closing. On a lot of players are leaving. Plus, Regan Campbell-Gillard, I like him, and I think the way he left Penrith and how that relationship soured while he was there, I think for him to win would be a big fu to Penrith. There's a lot of Wonga Blake as well. He's an ex-Penrith player, so there's a couple of ex-Penrith players in the Parramatta team. This is going to be a fun matchup. I think Parramatta will have studied the footage from opening round of the finals. They'll also look at how they played them in the regular season. And I think this Penrith side this year are going in slightly undercooked, but 3 grand finals in a row, that's hard to do. They're going for back-to-back. Obviously, the Roosters were the last team to do that, and the only team. To be fair, I think Penrith, when they got the grand final in 2020 and obviously winning it last year, I thought that was fantastic. They hadn't been successful for a very long time. Their youth program is fantastic. However, yeah, I think some of the actions of some of their players on and off the field haven't helped them. And they do come across as a bit arrogant, but their youth system is fantastic. they've got too many youth players coming through. I'm surprised Charlie Staines has been forced out really for May, even though May, there is, but you have to understand the Mount Druitt area. I'm sure you do. Obviously, the Sydney crime wave right now, the gang wars that are going on. For a lot of these kids who've made it through the Parramatta and the Penrith systems, and to a certain extent West Tigers as well. It is an escape from gangs. Basically, it is an escape from the humdrum existence. There is an issue, and yes, there is not enough attention paid to what a lot of these players are doing off the field in regards to working with youth groups and trying to combat the gang culture and the violence that is happening in Greater Western Sydney and Southwestern Sydney. And I have been following this. I have got a friend who lives in Balmain. She moved over to Australia many years ago and is now lives in Balmain. So I've got a friend over in Western Sydney, and I've got a lot of subscribers from Australia. Unfortunately, yes, I think they are young. There is a little bit of arrogance with some of the players, and I think May is one of them. I think the incident last year with Canberra, where there was that punch up on their way to the Premiership. Yeah, you could argue, but a lot of these players are local lads. They come through the local system. They come through, and there is that unfortunate gang culture in the Greater Western Sydney, Inner Western Sydney, Greater Western Southwest Sydney. And there is that deprivation in certain areas of the city. Same in London over here in the UK. There's great wealth in one suburb, and then the next round the corner. And I will give an example, which is near where Wimbledon play, AFC Wimbledon play. You've got Surbiton, which is one of the nicest areas in Greater London, and then you've got literally across the crossroads is Norbiton, one of the most deprived areas in Greater London. And I tell you now, my ex-partner used to work in Kingston upon Thames. And I lived with her for a little bit in Sunbury on Thames, which is right on the edge of Greater London, right on the edge of Surrey. So geography nerds will know what I'm talking about. Kingston upon Thames is one of the wealthiest, safest boroughs in Greater London. Low crime rate. I think only 2 murders in 60 years, for example, in Kingston upon Thames that are gang related. And Surbiton is right on the edge of Kingston upon Thames, of that part of London. Norbiton's in the next borough, but it's literally 100 metres or so the next. And it's completely different. Wimbledon, people think, Wimbledon with tennis, and it's celebrities live there. And you've got Richmond Park up the road, Wimbledon Common. It's a lovely area. Wimbledon really isn't. There was a lad I went to school with. His uncle used to live in Wimbledon, and we went to his uncle's house for the day. And I tell you now, it wasn't as pleasant as you see on the TV with the SW19 and the Wimbledon tennis in the height of summer. Trust me, Wimbledon is nowhere. It's not pleasant. Greater London is London in general is a city of contrast, much like Sydney, much like Melbourne. Great city of contrast. And a lot of these Penrith and Parramatta players have come through, their systems and their catchment areas. There's a lot of deprivation. There's a lot of poverty. There's a lot of crime, and the postcode gangs and the violence in Sydney is mirroring the violence we had in Melbourne the decade earlier with their gangland war. And when I watch NRL 360 and when I watch other programs, it is brought up where while Penrith on the field are coming across as arrogant, a lot of their players off the field are actually doing great things. Same with Parramatta, doing great things, going into the community, meeting with community groups, youth groups, charities, and giving tool talks basically to young offenders, saying you've got to put down the guns and knives and the drugs, and there's and they're doing a lot off the field, which doesn't get the coverage it should at a time it should. But I think Penrith on the field have worn off their honeymoon period. But you cannot doubt that the way Penrith played the game is even better than how Melbourne Storm have played the game over the last 15 years. I think their style of play is far ahead of what the great Melbourne Storm and Brisbane Broncos sides and Canberra Raiders sides of the 90s, 2000s, and 2010s. That they are, it's a complete contrast. No, I wouldn't say that. I do think there is a hint of youthful, arrogant exuberance. I think is the best way I could describe Penrith. I mean, I've been watching the NRL for a very, very long time. I've never liked the Melbourne Storm though. I think there's always something about the culture of that club. But they say they've got this no dickhead policy. But I look at the Melbourne Storm and I actually am raising an eyebrow about some of the things that have happened there and some of the things they've brought into the game, like the wrestle and some of the tackle techniques. And you know, Penrith, look, what they've done over the last 3 years, there is no doubt that they have been a very, very good side, and they're very well coached. And Ivan Cleary's now got over that grand final hoodoo. He's done it. He's now got them to 3 in a row, which is fantastic to do as a coach. I mean, he's a future immortal on the coaching side of things. When Wayne Bennett decides to call it a day, and Ivan Cleary and you know Craig Bellyache, when they call it a day, they're going to be immortal coaches, in my opinion. And I do think some of the players they are coaching right now, and of course Wayne Bennett next year with the Dolphins, will be future immortals. I have no doubt on that. But right now, yeah, I do think the way that they come across is a bit smug and arrogant, and not in a good way, because and I think it is something to do with a little bit of that Western Sydney chip on the shoulder kind of culture. I think Parramatta have a little bit of that as well. And then you've got the Sydney Roosters, South Sydney Rabbitohs ding dong that they're having right now, and the issues with Latrell Mitchell and the booing and all that. We'll see what happens. I hope Parramatta win because it's been such a long time. 3 years before I was born since they last lifted the Premiership. It's one of the longest droughts in the history of the game. I hope they break it. I really do. I really, really do. It's their third grand final since '86. All of their grand finals since they last won have happened in the NRL era, 2001, 2009, and now. I hope they get over the line. I think they will. I did say whoever wins out of the North Queensland Cowboys Parramatta Eels game, ironically, will win the grand final. Look, Roosters Rabbitohs. That's a brutal fixture. The fans hate each other. The clubs hate each other. And back in the day, if you crossed the wrong side of the street, you'd get the living crap kicked out of you by the other fan base. Obviously, Bondi back in the day was a nasty suburb. It's not anymore. It's a bit more gentrified. But Nick Politis, Uncle Nick, love him or hate him, and he divides opinion. And people are questioning whether the Roosters are breaking the salary cap with how they can sign players and keep retain the team they have had, and various things. There is a needle in that fixture. There is. Had been for a long time. It goes back to the early days, and it is more than just a rugby league fixture and a rugby league rivalry. It is an inner Sydney rivalry that goes way back. But my God, that round, that finals game this year was ridiculous, and that round 25 game was ridiculous. Oh no, yeah, I know. Parramatta's drought is not the longest. I think it's the longest active. I'm not mistaken. I think it's the longest active, but not the longest overall time. Absolutely. But first grand final of the decade. First grand final in I think it's 13 years. Obviously Nathan Hindmarsh never won a grand final, and I think Nathan Hindmarsh is the player with the most games played without a grand final winners medal. let that sink in. But yeah, and look, the Canberra Raiders, how their second half of the season as a Raiders fan, it was fantastic. And of course, that 2019 final, I think we were robbed. I think there were some bad refereeing decisions that have led to rule changes subsequently, which I think are a bit reactionary. But those, I'm not bitter about it. I do think since the 2019 grand final, we're not as good as what we were in 2019. But yeah, that six again call and the controversy about that has now ultimately led to rule changes under Peter V'landys as the boss. And we can all argue the pros and cons of the Todd Greenberg era and the success he's made with TV deals and more investment in the game, and then the scandal surrounding the NRL. In regards to Newcastle Knights, that's well, there's two teams that have never won one: Gold Coast and technically, if you want to get really technical, the New Zealand Warriors have never won one. The New Zealand Warriors have never won a premiership. There you go. They've been to two grand finals, never won a premiership. Technically, they've got the longest drought because they've never won one, and they've been in the league twice as long as Gold Coast. So I would say the New Zealand Warriors, because Newcastle won their two premierships after the Warriors became a franchise. So I would say the New Zealand Warriors. This is where I think long term I can't see the Warriors staying in New Zealand. I can see them being sold to an Australian and relocated. I would say Gold Coast as a region hasn't had a consistent side throughout their entire existence, whereas the New Zealand Warriors have always been in New Zealand since they came in the league, and they came in the league before Newcastle won their two premierships. So I would say the New Zealand Warriors is the least successful. Gold Coast and New Zealand Warriors are two least successful teams. Although West Tigers this year, what a shambles! Again, I will have to do. Once the NRL season is done, I will look at each NRL season from '98 till now. Well, we've covered '98 and '99 with the Western Suburbs. We'll look at other bad seasons. Yeah, no, the New Zealand Warriors, they have been, apart from the two grand finals and a couple of finals, they've never had a wooden spoon, but they've never won anything. So they've never had a minor premiership either. As far as I know, they might have one. But the New Zealand Warriors have been mediocre for their entire existence, if we're being honest. I can see that side being moved out of New Zealand into Australia at some point, if this continues, because the player exodus is there for all to see. And in my opinion, okay, so they have a minor premiership, that's it. So they've basically been mediocre for most of their existence. 20 years ago, they won the minor premiership. They've done nothing else apart from two grand finals. Yes, they've never had a wooden spoon, but they are not great, are they? And to be quite honest, I've got to do a video on every wooden spoonist from '98 till this year. I've covered this year in '98 and '99. Then we've got to do 2000 to 2021, and I will go backwards from 2021 till 2000, and we will cover every NRL wooden spoon season because they are the worst seasons on record, obviously. And there will be some wooden spoon seasons that are better than some teams that have never won a wooden spoon and their worst ever seasons. So the Warriors this year, for example, pretty bad season. There'll be some wooden spoon seasons where that team played better, had a better points percentage or higher points totals than. There you go. The fact that they've actually gone out of business, been reformed, basically, name change is all that it is, Auckland to New Zealand, hasn't changed the fact that they're basically crap. And the West Tigers, since the formation of the West Tigers as a joint venture, did you guys not watch my Western Suburb Magpies '98 and '99 shocking seasons video? Because that sums up how shockingly bad the West Tigers have inherited crap, basically. And that club is a basket case. I know people saying the club should be split up, either Balmain or Western Suburbs come back into the league, or move the team to Perth and completely sell the team on and fix the whole thing, because the West Tigers is not working at all. The West Tigers is not working. It hasn't worked. Yeah, Premiership aside and Sheensy aside, and I've done a video on the history of the league up in 2018, so 4 years ago, and we looked at you know Premiership success, wooden spoons, and at that point they didn't have a wooden spoon. Now they do. So do Brisbane, the Broncos, and the West Tigers are a mess. Yeah, I look Balmain and Western Suburbs. Jesus, it's been a shambles of an existence for 22 years. They really are a shockingly run side. Look at the talent they've let go. That should basically sum up the situation. Look at the talent they've let go since the both clubs merged. They are and don't get me wrong, St George Illawarra aren't much better, if we're being honest. I would say Balmain was still pretty decent in the 80s with Blocker Roach in the side. They were still decent in the 80s. Balmain. The 90s killed them. The Super League war killed them. Western Suburbs were a basket case from the Rodonikis playing days. They were a shambles right up to his coaching days, right at the end. They had money problems. It's nice to talk about the NRL and the AFL rather than English football and Gareth Southgate. It's a pleasant change of scene. It really is a pleasant change of scene. Oh God, yeah, no, I've done my video on that and the Super League war. I've done my video. My view on the Super League war and the chaos that caused is my similar view to the LIV golf with the PGA right now. That is the comparison I use, along with the WHA and the NHL. The NHL spent the whole decade of the 80s recovering from the WHA NHL battle. And then in the 90s, we had lockouts and strikes, and into the 2000s, we had lockouts, and 2010s, we had lockouts. So the NHL took, I'm going to say 30 years to fully recover from the WHA NHL rivalry in the 70s. And if you don't follow ice hockey, seriously, look at the NHL versus the WHA, the money that was being thrown around at the time, and you can compare it to the Super League war of the 90s. And the impact was exactly the same. Teams went out of business, teams were relocated, the league stagnated for a decade, and then expansion was the solution in the 90s, and then that stops in 2000. And then we get a relocation in 2011 with Atlanta going to Winnipeg. And then you get Vegas and Seattle joining the league in more recent times. No. Buffalo Sabres. Buffalo Sabres, I think, is possibly the worst. No, actually, no. I think West Tigers, the West Tigers, Buffalo Sabres, and the Sacramento Kings. I think you've got three teams there that are really bad. I would say the Detroit Lions is a poorly run team as well. There are a lot of really badly run teams in leagues that do not have promotion and relegation. And I could do videos on the longest playoff droughts in Major League sports. And West Tigers is one of them. There are some bad ones. And there were some teams that were just historically bad that no longer exist for a reason. If we're looking at the St George Illawarra Dragons, they've got issues in the boardroom that is ultimately impacting the team on the field. And yeah, they've had some great players play with them over the years. They're better run, I think, than the West Tigers. But yes. List of mediocrity: Buffalo Sabres, West Tigers, Sacramento Kings, Detroit Lions, Gold Coast Suns. Yeah, I think that's fair. I think the Gold Coast Suns have never been relevant. Really, they don't do much. They're just there because the AFL's put them there, and that is a fact. The AFL would put them in there as an expansion team. They do better than Greater Western Sydney, I think. But the AFL has put Gold Coast and Greater Western Sydney in those positions. Has it truly worked? I don't think so. Personally, I think that's my feeling on it. But the AFL, I think, has got far bigger problems now with what's come out with Hawthorn and what's going to come out with, I think, in that report. That I think the AFL is aware there's worse stuff than what's come out in the media in that report. And then we could open up the Pandora's box, which could involve every team in the league. But no, the Buffalo Sabres just are really bad. But the Vancouver Canucks aren't much better than the NHL. Let's be honest. Neither are the Phoenix, now Arizona. Um, Coyotes. Great Western City. They just don't draw fans. They just do not draw fans because they play in Canberra. If they played in Sydney alongside the Sydney Swans at the Sydney Cricket Ground, for example, they could draw fans. If they built a custom built oval in the Greater Western Sydney area, they could draw fans. It's either that or they're permanently called the Canberra whatever Canberra Giants. They then put them in Canberra permanently, call them the Giants, keep the Giants names, keep them in Canberra, redesign the logo, and say Canberra's now this is where this team plays because it's not working with the vagueness of the catchment area. It's not working. The team itself might be pretty decent, and the players might be pretty. I don't think so. If the Canberra Raiders can pull it off in the NRL, and Canberra being a city of the federal capital, you have people from all over Australia who have moved there for work. So I think it could work because it's the capital city. You will get fans who come from and a demographic from all over the country that has come to work and reside in Canberra. That's my opinion. I think it can work because if the AFL is serious about taking it to the NRL, a location like Canberra is critical because Gold Coast, there's never been a successful team on the Gold Coast in any sport. Let's be clear on that. Canberra, that is a location where teams have been successful. And if you were to truly take on the NRL, do it in their backyard. Do it in their backyard. Because the NRL have put the Melbourne Storm in Melbourne. They have been successful. They get good crowd numbers. They've got a lot of fans, the most members of any NRL club. That's in a city that is AFL mad. They've got the most members of any NRL club. So I think on the field, Melbourne Storm is a success. With grassroots and junior football, not so much. And part of that is to do with the salary cap scandal and all the fines, and it hampered the development of Victorian rugby league. But I think the vagueness over Greater Western Sydney and where they play their home games. Fuck it, move the team to Canberra, call it the Canberra, Giants, rebrand the team, drop the Greater Western Sydney bollocks, or move the team permanently to Sydney, share the SCG with the Swans, or build a custom facility in Greater Western Sydney, which might alleviate some of the problems that Greater Western Sydney has, because we know that rugby league and AFL do great things for the community and local economies. And you might get bigger fan base. Take it to the NRL. If the AFL is serious about growing in non-traditional markets in New South Wales and Queensland, then either put a team in North Queensland or Darwin, and sort out the Tasmanian issue because that's a shambles. That is a shambles. That Tasmanian. Are we going to expand there or relocate North Melbourne there? Just fucking put a team there and get done with it because it's painful now. And I think Gil McLaughlin, I think he's had a very soft ride as AFL. The AFL has been up and down under his tenure, and now we have the Hawthorn Hawks scandal. I think what's going to come out with that is going to lead to Pandora's box being opened, and I think the AFL is in denial about its cultural issues, be it racism, bullying, player welfare. And I link in what's happening at Hawthorn to what happened at Essendon with the win at all costs mentality with the peptide scandal. Player welfare has been a secondary concern, regardless of the player's background and circumstance. I think player welfare in the AFL has become a secondary concern, win at all costs mentality. And as we've seen, it's not like the Adelaide camp in 2017. What's come out? about that. The peptide scandal at Essendon, other scandals with individual players and board members at other clubs. Um, yeah, definitely the AFL is in denial about the culture within their sport, within their league, and they were blindsided by that leak to the press midweek. They've been forced into taking action quicker than what they wanted on their timetable. The investigation is now not on their terms. Now, I credit Hawthorn with what they did with the information they received from their report. I think Hawthorn have done the right thing. I think the AFL, however, could have. They've done all right. They've done well in this situation. They could have done better because with the board, the task force they put together into investigating this report that Hawthorn have, I think is the right way to go about it. Absolutely. They could have been quicker in announcing, hang on a second, we have an ongoing investigation. We're not going to name the club or the people involved at this time, but they could have announced it straight away when they had that information on Gil McLaughlin's desk or on the integrity unit's desk. They could have come out and released a statement earlier. I think the leak to the press has forced their hand, and the timing I think was deliberate with the leaking to the press and the press release. I think that was a deliberate. It's put a lot of pressure on the AFL, but then come Thursday afternoon, they were acting like it wasn't a big deal. It was, and quite frankly, I think the AFL have been asleep at the wheel in regards to race relations, player welfare, and the culture within the sport at the AFL clubs. I want to see the competitive nature because I hope the NRL then goes into Adelaide and into Perth and puts a team there and fights back because competitiveness brings out the best. And there is that debate, who's winning the domestic market in Australia and who's winning the overseas market overseas. And in the US, that has now become a key battleground for both leagues. But what is interesting is both the AFL and NRL and the development junior leagues and bush football, as they call it, and grassroots, is nicking players from rugby union. So there is that. And of course, you've got the Olympics in Brisbane coming up in less than a decade. So there's a lot of infrastructure projects going into Queensland. And it wasn't long ago you had the Commonwealth Games as well. So both in Melbourne and I think on Gold Coast. So there's been a lot of infrastructure projects and the Olympics in Sydney, 20 years ago. So there's been a lot of investment in sport on the east and southeast of Australia. And it's a key battleground between the AFL and the NRL is the state of Victoria, really, is where the battle lines are really drawn. The AFL is trying to grow in New South Wales and Queensland. The NRL's chosen Melbourne as its battleground at the moment. And Perth and Adelaide, keep coming up as, okay, when Redcliffe joined the league, where will be that 18th team be? So that's become a key battleground as well. The state of origin, when rugby league takes state of origin on that that neutral ground, Adelaide and Perth especially, the crowd numbers are really good. They sell out. So it's interesting. It's interesting that the TV viewership is higher for NRL over AFL. Fans in attendance, obviously, the AFL has decided to ditch suburban stadiums and go for like the big ovals, like Optus and Marvel. And the MCG, obviously, they have a bigger attendance at the grand final. Whereas the NRL has gone with the suburban ground and continued with the suburban ground and has a dedicated Magic round. So it's an interesting battleground. It really is. But as I say, at the end of the day, well, yeah, I do think that. Obviously, I have a lot of Australian subscribers, so I will continue to make AFL and NRL content. I wish the AFL content I was making was happy, and I will be doing a Hawthorn Hawks video, and I'll be discussing what's come out this week, and I wouldn't be surprised if Four Corners does a program on it coming up, because I think the issue is deeper than Hawthorn Hawks. I think it's deeper than that premiership window they have, the 4 premierships. I think the AFL does have massive cultural issues. Within the culture, when I say dressing room culture, within the culture of clubs, I'm not saying about, and that includes, relationships with the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities, player welfare, the win at all costs mentality, the lads culture, because we've seen a lot of racist and sexist remarks and player misbehaviour, which is more than just Ben Cousins. I think who was that Triple M presenter who's been done for domestic violence and drugs and alcohol. He does the midweek rub and Sunday rub. He's been sort of a bit of a twat. I forget his name, but it'll come to me in time. The way that this has all come out, this is not an isolated issue, and I think it's the culture within the AFL is runs deeper than racism with and cultural, sensitivities in regards to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander. I think it's far bigger welfare concerns, in my opinion. So when I do the AFL content, I do it with a heavy heart because it's a negative story in regards to the Hawthorn Hawks scandal. And I do honestly believe it's going to have it's opening the Pandora's box. But there we go. Thank you very much for all your questions. It's actually kind of nice to discuss non-football stuff. And we discussed obviously golf, and we discussed rugby league and Aussie rules, and yes, Gareth Southgate and his position did get mentioned, and the defeat to Italy, and we've only got one more game before the World Cup, so that's going to be interesting to see how that plays out. And of course, the Rugby League World Cup is now just a couple of weeks away. So and England plays tomorrow in the first opening game. So that's going to be really interesting to see how that plays out. I do have some time off in November and December, so I'll be able to watch a lot of the Rugby League World Cup and Football World Cups matches. So I'll be trying to cover as much content as I can. But for me, for now, thank you very much for watching. I'll have some more content for you very, very soon. But for me, it's goodbye for now. And, well, see you all soon.